All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Sarah, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at McFarland. And we are honored to have Nengher Vang here. He is a professor at UW-Whitewater, and he and his partner have opened up the Mekong here in McFarland. So if you haven't had a chance to go yet, hopefully the food that he has provided and his partner have provided will entice you to go there. So we're going to learn a little bit about the history of the Hmong Americans here in Wisconsin, and it's quite the rich, long journey of a history. So please welcome Nengher Vang.
Wow. Hey. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming. And I also wanted to thank Katie and Sarah for putting this presentations of this event together too. And so thank you again for coming. I plan to talk for about maybe 30 to maybe 35, maybe 40 minutes, right? And so, and then we will have some, time after the presentations for questions and, discussions and engagement and so on, okay? So I wanted to begin, I'm going to give you maybe like a 5,000 year history in about 30 to 35 minutes or so, right? And so I want to begin by, giving us a sense of the number of Hmong people in the state of Wisconsin. And so you can see in 2013, we have about 55,000 Hmong in the state of Wisconsin. Now, the number has jumped to 73,000 or so, right? Close to 74,000. And so substantial number within a decade, right? 20,000 or so within a decade. And so, and in the state of Wisconsin, they are in multiple counties, right? Maybe the largest one is in Milwaukee. But here in Dane County, we have about 5,000 or so. Right? And so not substantial, but a sizable population here in Dane County as well. Right? But again, they are distributed in multiple counties throughout the state of Wisconsin. And so given the size of the number of Hmong people in the state of Wisconsin, again, still, so many people do not know about Hmong people. And so I thought I'd give you an overview of who they are and how they came to this country. And so a number of things that we're looking at today, right? Give you an overview of who they are. Want to talk about why and how they came to this country, and then how they have adjusted to American society or to Wisconsin. And then toward the end, I'm going to probably highlight just a little bit, briefly, their cosmology, right? Give us a sense of their religious worldview, and then also just briefly say something about their food or culinary traditions, okay? So I'm going to give you sort of 5,000 year history here. And so Hmong came from, originally from China, right? They were found some 5,000 years ago north of, in the Yellow River Valley, north of today's Beijing. And from some of the studies that they now find, more recent studies, they said that Hmong are probably the first people to discover and grow rice. Rice was found in this particular regions in China, and Hmong were the people who first inhabited that region. And so it's very likely that Hmong people were the first group of people to discover and plant or grow rice. Now, in the 18th century, they migrated to Southeast Asia. And they did so to escape persecutions back in China. They escaped wars back in China. But many of them were also looking for new land. And so they moved to Southeast Asia. And many of them settled in Vietnam, Laos, and then some moved to Thailand and Burma. Dr. Yang Dao, here in this picture, up there, it's the first Hmong person to receive a PhD. And he estimated that Hmong arrived in Laos between 1810 and 1820. When they arrived in Laos, they lived, again, sort of isolated villages up in northern Laos, mostly in sort of the vicinity where they call the Plain of Jars, in Siang Kwan province in northern Laos. And so they engage in what we call subsistence farming. Right? They grow food crops that are good for consumptions, not necessarily cash crop, but subsistence crop. So things like rice, corn, cucumbers, and so on for family consumptions. In some ways, they lived a relatively autonomous and peaceful life up until the French colonized the regions in the late 1800s. And so, again, we'll talk a little bit about their cosmology here, right? And so, in the highlands of Laos, they practice a certain kind of religious or cultural life there. And so, I'm going to sort of give you a sense of their cosmology. And so, this is a work done by this anthropologist, Patricia Simmons. And she conceptualized Hmong cosmology as a balance or opposite. And what she meant by that is that she said that Hmong people believe that the universe is divided between this land of light and land of darkness, and that the shaman is the link between the land of light and the land of darkness. Okay? And so everything that they have in their world, right, it's divided between the two opposites, right? And so the universe, again, between land of light and the land of darkness in terms of physical space, house versus outside or the forest, or inside and outside. Spirits, they think about ancestral spirits being good spirits, and then wild spirits being animals or evil spirits. In terms of gender relations, they also think about gender relations too, and they said that gender relations, that's the gender switch at each reincarnations. So say, for example, if you're a man this life, right, and your next life you'll be a woman, and so on. And so when they think about sort of illnesses or human tragedies, they said that illnesses and human tragedies are the consequence of this balance being tipped out of balance, right, becoming imbalance. And so take, for example, they said, let's say, for example, our place is supposed to be inside the home, and inside the home we are guarded by the ancestral spirits, or we're protected by the ancestral spirits. And so inside the home it's safe. But once you venture into the forest, go into the jungle, that's outside, right? And so you will encounter evil spirits, and you essentially tip that balance off, right? So there's an imbalance. And so when that happens, then you get, illnesses, or you get tragedies. And so again, shaman is the link between the two worlds. And so again, when people become ill, then they consulted a shaman. The shaman will come and perform a ceremony to restore that sense of balance, right? To restore that sense of balance. Another Hmong anthropologist, Vincent Her. Vincent is an anthropologist. He is a professor at UW-Whitewater. He did this study and conceptualized Hmong cosmology in this way. It says that Hmong cosmology, or that Hmong think about sort of cosmology consisting of three realms. So the universe consists of three realms. And so here we got the the upper realm, and earth and the spirit world, right? And so he says that the soul, right, it's what connects the three realms, right? The cycle of the soul. And so rebirth, right, is the ultimate aim, he says, in Hmong cosmology. So compare that to, say, for example, in the Christian worldview, right? In Christianity, rebirth is not necessarily the ultimate aim, right? The ultimate aim is for the soul to go to heaven, or to be with God, right? To be reunited with God. Now, in the Hmong worldview, right? The ultimate aim is rebirth, right? They want the soul to come back again and again and again. There is something, they said, right, beautiful about being humans, right? There's something good about humanity that you want it to come back again and again and again, right? Experience life, experience humanity. Now, if you compare that to Hinduism, for example, right? In Hinduism, again, that worldview says that the ultimate goal is to release the soul, right? It's not for you to come back and reborn again and again. If your soul continues to be in that cycle of reincarnations, right? Then you want your soul to be released from that cycle of reincarnations, right? To be ultimately, again, perhaps reunited with God, right? And so very different, right, from Hinduism and also Christianity in that sense. Again, rebirth is the ultimate aim. And so movement of the soul, it's guided by this Hoke, or guiding the way. And so this is a ceremony that they perform at a funeral to guide the soul of the deceased from place to place, all the way to his or her birthplace and to the other realm. And so the soul will be guided to go through this cycle, right? So from earth to the spirit world, and then the spirit world will go to the upper realm. And in the upper realm, they go and they get this so-called maybe paper of destiny, right? And so they go and grab this paper of destiny, and then they come back and reborn, and then go through the same cycle, that cycle of reincarnation again. And so Hmong, it's not absolutely clear, but it seems like they believe in this idea about predeterminisms or predestination, right? So they believe that your destiny or your life, your fate, if you will, on earth, it's very much predetermined, right? You go up into the upper realm and you get your paper of destiny, and that paper then determines what kind of life you have on earth. You know? And so, say for example, if somebody, this is an example, say if somebody passes away in Milwaukee, right? But that person has lived in all of these places, St. Paul, Portland, Sacramento, Thailand, and so on. And if the person is born in Laos, right, then at the funeral they would perform this guiding the way ceremony, right, to guide the soul of that deceased from Milwaukee to all the way, right, to every single place that the person has ever lived, all the way to his or her birthplace. And then they believe, right, that they go, once they get to his or her birthplace, they retrieve his or her placenta, which they believe to be the finest garment, the first and finest garment. Once they retrieve the placenta, they put on the placenta, then they guide the person, the deceased, into the other realm. Right? And so then, again, they go through this cycle where they get their paper of destiny, and then they come back and reborn again and go through the same cycle. And so under the French, Hmong lived under the French for 6 years. Now, during that 6 decades, the French did not do much, right, to develop Laos. And so in terms of education, for example, not a whole lot of education was developed during the French colonial period. And so not a single high school was established in the 6 decades that the French were in Laos. In 1940, right, just 7,000, right, out of a possible 1 million children were going to elementary school. Again, no high school, just elementary school. What the French did was they put in heavy taxes on the populations or the colonized subjects. They introduced opium into Laos, and so many people were addicted to opium, including Hmong people. Right? They were planting opium, and so initially Hmong people were planting subsistence crops, right? Crops that they need for family consumptions, right? But then, if they can't pay taxes, then the French will say, look, don't plant, corn or rice, right? You can't sell those at a high price. You can't pay your taxes. So plant opium, right? You can sell opiums and pay your taxes. And so many families were planting opium, and eventually they got addicted to opium themselves, right? That's the idea. But in any case, the French were forced to leave Indochina in 1954, right? When they were defeated in Dien Bien Phu, and they had to sign this agreement to leave Indochina. After the French, then the Americans came in, right? But we know that the Americans were not interested in Laos in particular before the French left Indochina. They had very little interest in that country before 1954. Right? And so before 1954, the focus was really on Vietnam, but not so much Laos. We had just one foreign service officer in Laos taking notes and sending notes back to the State Department. By 1955, however, right, Laos would become important in the eyes of the Americans. Right? They saw Laos as a key domino in the region. And so U.S. began then to create this program evaluation office in Laos. But on the surface, it seems like this is a pretty benign, this is a civilian office, right? But it's staffed entirely with retired military officers, and they were training local people, right, to promote U.S. military and political interest in the country. In 1961, President Kennedy came into office, and President Eisenhower, said to Kennedy, "You got to make sure that Laos does not fall into the hands of communism. If Laos were to fall into the hands of communism, the entire regions will fall into communism. You will see a domino effect in the regions." But the Geneva Accord in 1954 was a problem for the United States. Right? So on the one hand, the United States signed this peace to say, look, we will keep Laos as a neutral country. That is, we will not be sending troops to Laos, or we will not allow any foreign interventions in Laos. right? But on the other hand, U.S. had its own political military interest in the country, and that is to prevent Laos from falling to communism or to prevent the spread of communism in the region. And so the solution for them then is to engage in secret operations using the CIA, right? And so this is the beginning of U.S. and Hmong relations, right? So that relationship began with this very historic meeting between Bill Lear. Somehow my pointer doesn't do, oh, there you go. Where's the, it doesn't show. It's your TV, that's it, probably it, right? So it's Bill Lear and Vang Pao, right? The Hmong leader at the time. And so they met, and this, again, in Siang Khon province, northern Laos, at this very historic meeting. And so from that, after that meeting, they organized a special guerrilla unit, right, or a secret army called the Special Guerrilla Units. Eventually, right, at the beginning, you get a number of people, right, being recruited into the SGU, but that grew to some 40,000 at the height of the war in 1969. And Hmong soldiers were basically operating or carrying out a variety of tasks, right? So they were used to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail that ran through Laos and to South Vietnam. They provided intelligence on enemy operations. They guarded U.S. radar stations, direct air missions, air bombing missions in North Vietnam, engage in combat and in direct combat on the ground and so on. Right? And so 1973, U.S. signed this peace agreement to end the war. And I should say, let me go back to this here, that initially we get a few hundred people joining SGU, but again, eventually you get so many people recruited and joining SGU to fight against communist forces in the country. And as the men were killed off, right, in combat, then they replaced with children, right, as young as 12 years, or and so you get some images of very young people. As if they were able to carry a gun and go fight, then they were recruited to go and fight. And so we get so many young people, right, in SGU as well, fighting against communist forces in the country for the United States at the time. So 1973, again, U.S. signed a peace agreement to end the war in Southeast Asia. Under the peace agreements that they signed, U.S. would withdraw from Southeast Asia. Right? But at the same time, for some reason, allowing North Vietnamese to station their troops in South Vietnam. And so under the agreement, eventually you get South Vietnam, right, falling to communism, but Laos also fall to communism as well. After they signed the peace agreements, U.S. then stopped providing support or aid to Hmong fighters in the country. And so without U.S. support, that operations essentially collapsed. The communists took over Laos, Cambodia, and in Vietnam. And so we did ultimately have a dominant effect in the regions. Now, Laos fell to communism on May 15, 1975, but just a few days earlier, right, and just 6 days prior to the country falling into the hands of communism, the communist government declared in their newspaper that they wanted to exterminate the Hmong people. Right? This is a genocidal campaign against Hmong people because they were fighting for the United States, were on the side of the Americans, fighting against communist forces. And so they specifically targeted Hmong people for persecutions as a way of retaliating against Hmong people. So 5 days later, right after they declared that they were going to exterminate Hmong people, you get a flood of people going to this air base, the Long Ting air base. And so as many as 10,000 people were flooding this air base. In the end, about 2,500 were airlifted with American personnel to safety in Thailand. And so, recently, a couple of years ago, we saw this same scenario taking place in Kabul in Afghanistan, where you get the evacuations of American personnel, and then Afghans who served for the United States were just flooding the airport, right, trying to get on the planes with the Americans and so on. And so Hmong people saw something like that in Afghanistan, and it brings back memories of what took place for them in the 1970s. Eventually, Hmong would flee the country, and so eventually you get more than 100,000 or so fleeing the country. They became refugees, and they crossed the border to Thailand. They became refugees in Thailand, and then eventually they came to the United States, right? But if we go back to the 1970s, when we have a flood of Hmong refugees and other Southeast Asian refugees, going to Thailand and some other neighboring countries, U.S. response at the time was to pass a series of legislations or act. And so the 1975 Act in 1975 was passed in Congress. And under that act, Hmong refugees were not included, right? The 1975 Act gave preference to Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees. Cambodian refugees, because of the genocide that was taking place in Cambodia, right, under the Khmer Rouge. And you also get Vietnamese, right, being given preference because we get images like this, right? Boat refugees is what they were known. And so lots and lots of Vietnamese refugees were brought to the United States. Again, Cambodian refugees were also given preferences. In the same year, President Ford approved a plan to basically resettle Hmong refugees permanently in Thailand. Not to bring Hmong people to the United States, but to put them in Thailand on a permanent basis. 1976, that law or legislation was amended to include Hmong refugees. And so the question is, why were Hmong refugees excluded? And that had to do with the fact that Hmong people were deemed too primitive, right, to come to America, right? And the notion that they were highlanders or they were living in the highlands and that they were not maybe sophisticated enough, that they would not be able to survive in this country, they were too primitive to come to this country. And so I'm going to go to this. This is Lionel Rosenblatt. He was the president of Refugee International, the organization that was responsible for advocating for Southeast Asian refugees to come to America. And he said this, that he's been there working with Hmong people there as a Foreign Service officer in 1975, but the last sentence he says, senior U.S. officials who felt that it was good enough for them to fight for our country also felt that they were too primitive to come to this country. Even in the 1990s, we still get newspaper reports in this country painting Hmong people as being too primitive in this country. Right. But I'm going to go back to this. And so this is a picture of me when I was in the refugee camp. And that's me too, right before we came to America in the late 1980s. We were in the refugee camps, getting processed for resettlement in America. This is in Thailand. So I should say that I was in Thailand. I was in the refugee camp in Thailand for 8 years. And so once we found a sponsor, then we were processed for resettlement in the United States. And this is a picture that we took right before we came, dressed up pretty in our best clothes, right, getting ready to come to America.
How old are you?
I was 11 when we came. So when we got to America, I was 12. But we entered the camp, the refugee camp. When we got to the camp, I was 4. So I was in the camp for 8 years. So once U.S. decided now it's okay, we would accept Hmong refugees. They also then put in a policy known as a policy of dispersal, right? And so what that means is that they scatter Hmong refugees all over the place, right? In 25 different states, right? 53 different cities. And the goal of that policy is essentially to, do exactly what John Fink, this refugee resettlement officer was saying, to spread them like a thin layer of butter so they would disappear. So imagine this: if they send, let's say, for example, 5,000 people to McFarland, right? All of a sudden, the local residents will be alarmed. They'll see Hmong people shopping at the local stores and so on, and so they'll be alarmed. But if you send one family or 2 families to McFarland, nobody even notices that they're here. And so that's the goal. And so they send Hmong refugees all over the place, and they typically send them to places like Philadelphia, right, or Dallas, major cities like that where they would just disappear, right? Nobody even noticed that they're in their neighborhood, in their communities. But Hmong people eventually did what sociologists call a secondary migration, and what that meant is they eventually found out, my family, my brother got sent to St. Paul, and I'm sent, I'm here in Oregon, or Portland, Oregon, but my family is in Fresno, California, and so they eventually found out, and they moved, right? They moved to be with their family and so on, and so 1980, 70% of Hmong refugees were in 12 different states, but by 2015, right, so 83% were concentrating in just 3 states. And so that trend continues to this day, right, where you get substantial number of people, maybe 80%, more than 80% of Hmong Americans concentrating in just 3 states. California having the largest number, and then Minnesota, and then Wisconsin coming in third. Right? And so they move, right, for the purpose of, again, family reunifications. Right? They found out, again, that their brothers and siblings got sent, right, to a different state, and so they moved to be with their family. But there's also job opportunities, especially in Wisconsin and Minnesota, right? And so in the 1970s and 1980s, many of them were moving from places like Seattle, right? They were initially resettled in Seattle or Portland, Oregon, but they would move to California for the warmer weather. But also they were trying to get access to agriculture, right? And become farming down in California. But in the 1990s, many of them were moving to Wisconsin, many of them were moving to Minnesota for a number of reasons. Better social services, but also job opportunities. Right? And so many of you remember in the 1990s, under President Clinton, they had a welfare reform, right? And so under that welfare reform, so many people were losing the benefits, right? Welfare benefits, and so many people were moving to Wisconsin, moving to Minnesota for job opportunities. There were many manufacturing companies here, and so they got positions in manufacturing jobs. There's also this last factor, the factor of racism. And so many of them were resettled in places like Philadelphia, but when they were resettled in places like that, they were not resettled in sort of the better neighborhood, if you will, right? They were resettled because they were poor, and so they ended up living in public housings, or they were in the more ghetto places. And so there's a lot of crimes, there's also a lot of racism going on, and so many of them got experienced discrimination, they got experienced violence, and so many of them packed their belongings and moved. In the state of Wisconsin, we also experienced some of that in the 1970s and 1980s as well, right? So this is a study that was done on Hmong refugees who were resettled in the Eau Claire and Warsaw area in particular. And the study found that in the 1980s, right, Hmong refugees were coming in, resettled. Local residents were saying all kinds of things about about Hmong refugees as well, and so they were saying all kinds of rumors in the local newspapers, right? Things like Hmong were stealing and eating the neighbors' dogs, or that they were exploiting the welfare system. They breed like rats to just be on welfare. With their welfare payments, they purchased new model homes, cars, and things like that. The men were particularly lazy, right? They stay home, and all they did was they get their wives pregnant so that they could have more children, be on welfare. That they would get their children to run, in front of cars, so that they get big insurance settlement and things like that. So all kinds of things were said about Hmong refugees at the time, too. But since then, right? Again, the older generations don't necessarily get education in this country. Like my parents, they don't get education in this country. But the younger generations, or children, they will go to school, and so we see since then that we continue to have increasing number of Hmong people getting education, college educations, graduate school, and beyond. Right? So the number continues to grow up, and so you get 17% now being of people getting a bachelor degrees or higher. Right, but that continues to be a trend. And in the state of Wisconsin, we get so many Hmong students on all campuses throughout the state of Wisconsin, the UW system. And at Whitewater, we probably have a good 80 to 90 students on campus, but UW-Madison has probably several hundred, right, 200-300 people on campus. Given the higher education that they have, again, we see that Hmong people also, right, were employed in increasing number as well. And so 72%, right, we go from 1990, 22% were employed, but in 2017 or so, 2021, you get 72% being employed, so having jobs. Just 3% not unemployed nowadays. And income, right? In terms of median household income, again, if you look at the total populations, right? Household median income, it's actually higher than the total populations in the state of Wisconsin, right? So in the general populations, the average household income it's about 67,000, and Hmong medium household income it's slightly higher. Okay? I should say, home ownership has also gone up significantly too in the past decade or so. A significant number of Hmong people are buying homes and owning their own homes and so on. And in the state of Wisconsin, Hmong also are engaging in politics, right? They're pretty active in politics as well, especially at the local and at the state level, and so or local level. And so many of them got elected to public office. Public school boards, city council, county supervisor, judge, and so on. And we see the same trend throughout, the United States, but particularly in Minnesota and California, where there's, sizable Hmong populations, right? They're also pretty active in politics, local politics and state politics. And so many of them got elected to the House of Representatives, Senate, or many of them got elected as mayor, so pretty active in terms of industry. They're basically in all kinds of industry, right? All manufacturing, finance, retail, professional work, education, health, social services, arts and entertainment, and other industries, and so on. Right? They're engaging in all kinds of industries of this country. Now, in terms of arts and entertainment, many of you may or may not know this, but several years ago, right, we have Sunisa Lee representing the United States and at the Olympic in Tokyo, and winning the gold medal for the team, the U.S. gymnastic team. Oh, there you go. I think I talked about that already, and so I'm going to go to this here, talk a little bit about the culinary traditions. And so we go from very simple, right, flavorful dish with something like that, right? And so you get, this is a pretty typical Hmong sort of traditional food, right, where they get rice and then just chicken, right, broiled chicken with some herbs, right? Very plain, very simple, right? Not a lot of spices and things like that, right? Just very plain. And this is, I should say, it's a dish that Hmong women will get after they give birth, right? So during this postpartum period, every Hmong woman would eat this for 30 days. Okay, they don't get anything else. This is what they get for 30 days. This chicken diet for 30 days, okay? And so nothing else, no spices, nothing like that, right? And so they get this, and then after the 30 days, they can go with anything else. And so, but then because Hmong have lived in China, Southeast Asia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on, and they adopt, they borrow, right? Different ingredients, different culinary food traditions from the neighboring countries and cultures, and so now you get much more sort of a sophisticated, all kinds of ingredients and herbs and spices all mixed that in there. And so things like the pho, right? The pho, it's something that they got from Vietnamese, right, or Vietnam, or they get maybe crab brain groom from some other cultures, right? Maybe China or some other culture. And so nowadays, again, the kinds of things that you get here today, the samples that you get are not necessarily, pure or traditional Hmong food, right? But it's the kind of food that they get as they, borrow from other cultures and other traditions around in the neighboring countries. All right, so considering that they were thought of as too primitive to come to America in the 1970s, and despite the fact that they faced many challenges in this country, as in the beginning, Hmong Americans have come a long, long way, right? They have made Americans, or the United States, Wisconsin their new home. They created new life in this country. they make, things work in this country. So, that's it. I'm gonna open it up for questions and comments. So again, 5,000 years of history, right? And 30 or 35 minutes or so. Any questions? Anything that interests you? Doesn't have to be, what's on the PowerPoint, but anything on your mind.
Yeah, you described a situation where when the Hmong arrived in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of adversity, a lot of difficulty in adjusting and being accepted, which actually is part of the American tradition of dealing with immigrants going back, to the 1700s, unfortunately. But yeah, from then to the 90s, where it sounded like most of the Hmong were doing very well, educationally, in terms of employment and so on. It's not a long time. What would you attribute that pretty quick success story to? Is it something internal to the Hmong culture that made them unusually adaptable? Or was it something about American culture that, found something useful and accepting towards the Hmong?
Yeah, I think probably a combination. But if you think about sort of maybe the history of the Hmong people, right, from China all the way to Southeast Asia and to America, they've experienced so much maybe suffering and persecutions in their life. And even under the French, again, they were not giving much access to education. And so the emphasis on education has always been there for Hmong parents. And they emphasize this, that this is it. You're in America, this is the key. We were not educated, we didn't have any education back in Southeast Asia, but here in America, you got that chance. And so maximize that opportunity, right? And so all the children were told to work hard, to study hard, right? And work hard in school. And so that's part of it. But I guess also because of their prior experience in Southeast Asia, right? Especially during both during the French era and also during the American period as well, right? Where you get Hmong not only working with the French in some ways, right? Trying to negotiate their way of life with the French and so on. And so some Hmong were also, right, put in positions of power in the colonial administration as well. But then especially during the American period, right, many of them were also educated and so were trained by Americans. And so not only were they, fighting or getting trained to fight, to use airplanes, to go on becoming pilots and fight. But then many of them were also trained to become nurses and teachers and so on. And so many people were also getting access to education. And I should say, right, again, that during the French period, not many people got access to educations. But during the American period, when the Americans came in, one of the things that they did was provide all kinds of training to Hmong people. And so Hmong were trained to become nurses, teachers, principals, and all kinds of other civilian positions, as well as military positions. And so they had all of that experience. And so when they came to this country, they basically said to their children, look, in education is important. We saw how education, right, provided a path toward, positions of power or political, positions in the government. If people were educated back in Southeast Asia, they got positions in the government. And so Hmong parents would say, look, if you want to be, successful, if you want to have power and prestige, you work hard, you study hard, so that you can be like one of those people, right? They will name people like Vang Pao, or they will name people like the Hmong pilot, Li Lu, who flew some 5,000, missions before he was finally shot down. Now, American pilots will be sent home during the war, right? After they flew their 100th mission, bombing missions over Vietnam, they will be sent home, right? But Hmong pilots, they fight until they are killed. So so they would say, look at Li Lu, right? Or they point to heroes like that and say, look, be like them, right? Or if you want to have positions in the government, or if you want to be successful, work hard and study hard. So all of that helped. But there's also a thing about sort of maybe Hmong cultural traditions too, and that is that when they have a funeral ceremony, especially if an elderly person passes away, one of the things that they do is they get an elder in the community to come, and this elder's job is basically to perform this blessing ceremony. Right? And so he will perform the ceremony. He will say, look, your father or your mother or your grandpa has passed away, but he's leaving you all this word of advice. And so he will give them, he will tell them, your dad says that when you should go to school, or you should study hard, love each other, and work hard. And so that too, but then also, at the same time, they also do a blessing ceremony where they say, look, even though your, parent, your dad, your mom has passed away, he is blessing you so that you continue to be prosperous, right? So work hard and study hard, but you will be blessed by your parents, and so on and so on. And so I think all of those, the cultural traditions help them to recognize, work hard so that we can be successful. And so all of those things will help. Mm-hmm.
I worked with the refugee program at Lutheran Social Service back in the 1980s, early 1980s. And working with churches to find sponsors. And one of the questions a lot of folks might have is, why did so many Hmong people end up in Wisconsin and Minnesota? And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that Lutheran Social Service had a very strong network of offices that was already in place. And so the State Department, they had multiple agencies that could do resettlement. But LSS had this strong network of offices throughout the whole state of Wisconsin, all of Minnesota. Plus, they had a lot of Lutheran churches.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
And so, consequently, they were able to funnel a lot of people through that system, through that network. Even though, as you said, the concept of just spreading people out, it didn't make a lot of sense, because you got people who were displaced, they were uprooted, and they needed some way of reestablishing a community for themselves. Right. But that's what has happened.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that piece up, and that's true. That's very true. One of the reasons why we have a substantial number of Hmong refugees in Wisconsin and Minnesota has to do with that piece.
It's counterintuitive in terms of climate. It's like where would you have these folks from a very humid climate settled? Not in Minnesota or Wisconsin.
That's true. And so it's in large part because of the Lutheran churches and the Lutheran Social Service that brought so many Hmong refugees to Wisconsin, especially in the 1970s and early 1980s. And so at the beginning, I should say, that Hmong people can't bring their own people to this country. So it's the churches like the Lutheran Social Service that brought Hmong families first. And so once you got a family in this country, then they can then even turn around and sponsor more people, more families. But at the very beginning, again, you have to have a sponsor in this country to sponsor people to come in. And it's the Lutheran Social Service that sponsor many Hmong refugee families at the beginning. And so after 1980, I think it's after 1980 when they passed the Refugee Act of 1980, that Hmong refugees then can then turn around and sponsor more refugees to come in, because prior to that, again, you need a sponsor, but once you are here, then you can again turn, for the purpose of family reunifications, they allow you to turn around and sponsor more refugees. And so you eventually get, again, substantial number of people in Wisconsin because of some other factors that I highlighted: family reunifications, job opportunities, but job opportunities particularly in the mid-1980s and 90s, like after welfare reform.
Can you tell us more about the shaman? What did they do when they were called in?
Oh, okay. So So again, if somebody is ill, or sick, and they believe again that balance it's tip off or it's out of balance, and so they call in the shaman. The shaman comes in and the shaman performs a ceremony, to try to restore that balance. And so they go into this trance, and the shaman then the idea is that the shaman is communicating with the spirit, right? Let's say if they go into the forest, for example, right? They go hunting, then they know that they have ventured out of a safe space, and they would, they're going to be prone to being inflicted with some kind of tragedy by this evil spirit in the wild spirits in the forest. And so if they are going to the jungle or the forest to hunt, resulted in some sort of illness, and they consult the shaman. The shamans come in, and the shamans will then perform this ceremony and goes into this trance. And the idea is the shaman communicates with the spirit that they violated, right, in the jungle. And so they did some kind of negotiations, and so they might, and so depending on what the shaman finds, right, the shamans will send back the message and say, well, now the spirit that you have violated, right, wants this much paper money, right, and so they burn some paper money to go and propitiate the spirit, and so there's all of that going on during the ceremony, and then hopefully they restore the relationship or they restore the balance, and the person gets well.
Is the role of, you mentioned the role of shamanism is central to the cosmology. Is that still the case among the Hmong living in the United States now? Or what's the process for becoming a shaman?
Yep, so yeah, that's good. Yeah, so yes. So those who still practice the traditional religion, right, they continue to have the same sort of cosmological worldview, right? And so the shaman remains important in that traditions, in that community. If they continue to practice traditional belief, traditional religion, then the shaman remains important. Now, many in this country also converted to Christianity. And so when they converted to Christianity, then they have a different kind of worldview, right? So the shaman becomes less important in the Christian community, right? So they don't consult the shaman now, right? They go and they consult the pastor, right? So the pastor in some ways takes over the role of or replaces the shaman in the Christian community, right? So the pastor comes in and pray instead of performing, the shaman performing a ceremony. Right?
You mind telling us a little bit about your personal journey? You said you came here when you were...
I was 12, and so yeah, well, thank you. And so,
I'm right here.
yeah. So I was born in 1976, right? So a year after the communists came to power in Laos, and so for the first 4 years of my life, I was running, or moving from place to place within Laos, trying to escape persecutions. And so we finally made it across the border to Thailand when I was 4. And so again, I was in the refugee camp from the age of 4 to 12. And so 8 years in the refugee camps. We finally came to America in the late 1980s, 1988. And we were initially resettled in California. And so I went through middle school and high school in California, graduated from high school, went to Davidson College in North Carolina for my undergraduate. From there, I went on to get a master's degree in theological studies at this seminary in Denver. And when I was at this seminary, I was not training myself to become a pastor or a minister at the time, but I was really interested in what they had to offer. Right? When I was an undergraduate, I became fascinated with Dr. Martin Luther King's writings, and so I was very fascinated. And so I found that they had this King and Gandhi center at this seminary. But I was also interested at the time in philosophy and religion. And so I thought, this is the place for me to go to study religion and philosophy, but also, learn about nonviolence and study about King and Gandhi, right? So when I was there, I was, taking courses on King and Gandhi, but then I was also taking courses on international studies, right, at the University of Denver. And so I was taking courses on democracy and human rights and international conflict, and I became fascinated with that. And so I went from there to the University of Notre Dame to do a master's degree in international peace studies. When I got to Notre Dame, I was struggling too. I was struggling to understand many of the things that we were studying. And I said to myself, I'm struggling because I don't have a good, history understanding of history, particularly world history. And so that then, motivated me to go on and pursue a PhD in history. But when I got to the PhD program, I was not thinking about becoming a professor. That was not my thing. I was thinking, okay, I'm going to at some point maybe work for, an NGO like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, or maybe work for the United Nations and so on, right? Because, but then 3 years into it, I found out most of the students who were in the PhD program were thinking about teaching and research. And so at one point I did go into my advisor's office and said, look, I don't know if this is something for me. And she said, because I said, look, I was not thinking about becoming a professor or going into teaching or research. And this is what she said to me. I was gonna drop out. I said, look, this is not for me. She said, how many people from your community, how many Hmong people have a PhD? And I said, maybe just a dozen or so. And she said, how many people from your community have a PhD in history? And I said, 0. She said, there you go. That's your answer. Don't quit. Don't drop out, right? You finish this program, get your PhD, right? So that Hmong people have one person with a PhD in history, or you got one more person from your community with a PhD. And once you got that, you can go and do whatever you want, right? So I continued. I'm in the program. I graduated from the program, and eventually ended up going to teaching. And so here I am at Whitewater. But looking back, I'm glad I, listened to my advisor. It's been a great experience, a great journey for me to be, to teaching at Whitewater.
How did you get to open the restaurant then?
Oh, very good question. That's a good question. So again, we have no experience, running a restaurant or a bar or even the banquet hall, right? And since we came to Wisconsin in 2015, we've been sort of involved in various projects in the Hmong community. And one of the things that we noticed is that Hmong people do not have a banquet hall for them to hold their cultural celebrations. And so we've been thinking, it would be nice to have a place for Hmong people to come and do their cultural events and, do their celebrate, graduations and weddings and things like that. And so we've been thinking, but we were not actively looking for a place. And so last April, we were actually looking for a house to buy for us. And so we saw this property in Marshall. It's a beautiful home. It's sitting on a 5-acre lot. And on the same lot was this pole barn, probably 10,000 plus square foot, huge pole barn. And so my wife was like, well, let's go ahead and buy this property. It's a beautiful home. It's on a 5-acre lot. This is going to be our dream home. We're going to stay here forever. And so I said, what about this barn? What are we going to do with this? And so she said, you know what? We've been thinking about event venue. Why don't we convert this into an event venue for Hmong people to come and rent and do their graduations and things like that? And so I called the village there, and they said, look, you can't do that here. That property is zoned for residentials only. And so I kind of gave up the idea. But then probably 3 days later, right, my wife came back to me and said, look, I found, I found a property in McFarland. Let's go look at the property. And so we came and we saw the building there, and she says, this is it. We're going to buy this place, right? And I said to her, are you sure we're going to buy this place? We don't even know how to, we don't even drink. I don't even drink, right? And so I said, are you sure we're going to do this? This is, we don't even know how to, we don't even drink. How are we going to run the bar or the restaurant? We have no experience, right? And she said, look, we're going to do this here. We will learn as we go, right? We'll make some mistakes along the way, but it's okay, And then I think in the end, we decided, we saw the need in the community for a space like that, and we saw an opportunity, and so we just said, look, let's go ahead and do it, because in the end, we decided that whatever we wanted to do, we just go ahead and do it, right? And we got one life to live. We do it, and if we're successful at this, fantastic. Thank God for it. If we're not successful, we'll learn a lot of things in the process. And so we jump in and grab this. And when we first got the place, we didn't know. Again, both of us don't drink, and so we don't even know what to do with the bar. And so we were looking for bartenders, and we got the first bartender, and she came in and she basically wrote a list of liquor and beer for us to purchase. And so I bought whatever that's on that list. And so I've been telling so many people who came through the restaurant that before opening this restaurant, I have never heard of Jameson, Captain Morgan, or Hennessy, and now and so, and before this, because I don't drink, I don't go to bar, and so I know people in the community drink, Bud Light, Miller Lite, but then all of a sudden, people are telling me, go buy Corona, go buy Modelo, and I'm like, oh, what are those? But then, so it's been 3.5 months now. But again, I still don't know everything that we have at the bar there. But we have good bartenders who know what they're doing. And so I remember I was watching this video by Jack Ma, right, who's the founder of Alibaba. And he says, look, the key to success is to surround yourself with people who are more knowledgeable than you are. And in some ways, we're blessed, we're so grateful that we found people who are more knowledgeable than we are about the restaurant, about the bar. And so they have been so helpful in helping us set everything up at the restaurant there. We made many mistakes along the way. Even thinking about things like, appliance in the kitchen. We initially bought the wrong appliance, and they didn't work. They were not efficient. We had to buy new ones, and some we were able to return, some we weren't able to return, and things like that. And so we made, but again, it's a learning process, and we learned quite a bit in the past 3.5 months that we opened the place. And the other thing I should say also is that we're so pleased and we're so grateful for the McFarland community for the outpouring support that people have shown us. They were so nice and so welcoming. They welcome us into McFarland, and people have been coming out to help us and to support us, at the restaurant. And so we're so grateful for that too.
So did you start this process last April?
Yeah, last April. April 24. We were searching for a house, and then we ended up buying this restaurant, and so now
I read about it when we first started. I can't believe that you pulled it together.
Yeah.
I think that just is a testament to the resilience of that culture.
Yeah. So we said, look, let's go for it, and we'll do whatever we can. And so it's been a fantastic journey. There were nights when my wife and I were like, oh my gosh, we wish we could go back. We missed the peace and the quiet nights that we have. We used to. My wife and I one of the things that we like to do is we'll spend time together, especially on Friday and Saturday, right? We'll spend time together, just sit and watch a movie together. And so sometimes we said to each other, oh man, I wish I could go back to those. But
Can you find enough help?
Huh?
Can you find enough help?
Yes. So we got a good group of people from our community, and also to help us, in the kitchen and things like, and so it's been good.
I know back in the late 70s, early 80s, a major leader was Vang Pao, General Vang Pao.
General Vang Pao, huh?
I'm just wondering, are there still kind of national leaders, or has that spread out into more local?
So good question. That's probably the sad part about the Hmong American experience, and that is that once as Vang Pao passed away in the early 2000s. So 2000, he passed away. I think 2000. I wanted to say 2011 or 2012, right around that time. And so Vang Pao was the Hmong leader during the war. He was the person who met with the CIA agent Bill Lear and began that whole secret operation in the country. And so we looked at Vang Pao as sort of the president or the leader of the Hmong people. And typically when we have a funeral, for an elder person, we do a 3-day ceremony, right? And so we began in the past. We used to begin on Friday, and then we would do a burial on Monday. So you go Friday, all the way to Monday morning, right? Monday afternoon for burial. But for Vang Pao, when he passed away, we did a 7-day ceremony, where you get people from all over the world, from France, Canada, Australia, Thailand, Laos, China, all over the place. They came for his funeral. So Vang Pao was really considered our leader, like a father figure for the Hmong people. But nowadays, I should say, we don't have a kind of a national leader now. And so that's the sort of maybe the tragedy of our experience in this country, where we just have local leaders. But nowadays, I think people look up to elected local Hmong leaders. And so people who are elected to the state level, especially, right, state legislatures, people look up to those. And in some ways, I mean, they also sort of provide sort of the bridge between the Hmong community and the mainstream community. And so Hmong parents who don't speak the language still look up to those individuals who are elected as the bridge to the two communities. Yeah.
What's the situation of the Hmong in Laos and Thailand now? And is there a lot of continuity, a lot of communication between the Hmong community here and the Hmong community back in South Asia?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So there's ongoing communications between Hmong here and Hmong in Southeast Asia, in Laos, and Thailand, Vietnam, and China. There's that, it's ongoing interactions and communications. And Hmong Americans periodically go to Laos and Thailand too, to revisit. Now, they couldn't do that for a long time, right? They couldn't go back to Laos up until the mid-1990s. And that's in part because the Laotian government did not allow Hmong people to go back and visit, right? And so people like Vang Pao and many of the military officers who worked during the CIA or for the CIA were on the Laotian government's blacklist. And so they couldn't go back and visit. But since the mid-1990s, and especially since the early 2000s, the Laotian government has opened its door and become more relaxed in its policy toward the Hmong diaspora, and so Hmong are able to go back to visit the homeland in significant number. And so every year, we get maybe 10, 20,000 people going back to Laos especially during the New Year, during December, the month of December and January. And so you get substantial. And the government also realized that, if they open their doors to Hmong Americans going back, they get all kinds of business, right? Because when we go, when they go, they spend all kinds of money in the country. And so they benefited economically. And so they open up their doors but there's that ongoing interactions and communications. I should say also that for a long time, there was this group of people who were stuck in the jungle of Laos. And I don't have the images here, but when I teach the course at the university, I would also teach this other component about the legacies of this war for Hmong refugees. And so certainly one of the consequences of the war is you get the massive number of Hmong refugees coming to this country and some other places like Canada, Australia, France, and so on. But back in Southeast Asia, you get this group of people who fought for the United States during the war, but they did not. They didn't cross the border, or they continue to stay in the country, but they couldn't stay. They couldn't stay in the village, or they couldn't stay in the towns and the city, right? So they, in the 1970s, as people were fleeing across the border, they chose to stay in some ways, right? Because they didn't want to leave. If they left, right, then it would be harder for them to go back into the homeland or go back to the villages. And so they stayed instead. So they can't stay in the village, but so they moved into the jungle, right? And so there's this group in the 1970s. There were about maybe 60,000 of them, right, hiding in the jungle, hoping somehow that the country was stable, would become stable soon, and they could go back and resume their agricultural life or traditional life and stay in the villages and so on. But because they were in the jungle, right, in the eyes of the government, they were considered sort of rebels or insurgents, right? And so the government will send government troops to go and try to, quote unquote, pacify them. And so there's that ongoing fighting between the Hmong people in the jungle and the government. And over the years, right now, probably just a few hundred people left, survived, are left in the jungle. Many people have died from starvations, from diseases, and from being killed and slaughtered by the Laotian government in the past 30, 40 years. So there's that aspect too, that again, so many people don't talk about that aspect as much. But there's all of that.
back in the 70s or late 70s or 80s, McFarland had a family in Bungs that were here.
Mhm. Yeah. Right now, there's still probably, I don't have the number of families that are in McFarland, but we do have maybe quite a sizable populations here in McFarland too. And not as much as, as many as in Madison or in some period. But probably maybe a good, probably 10, 20 families in McFarland as well. Right? But I mean, not as many.
That family moved to California when the oldest son went out there, and then later he got them all to go up there.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
I find all the data that you presented very informative. I thought I knew some things, but I didn't know much compared to what you shared here.
Well, thank you.
Do you sense, I was at a Hmong funeral a while ago, and they have their traditions or rituals at the cemetery specifically. And I was surprised when a 30-year-old mentioned that they're younger, and the younger generation doesn't believe that that tradition will continue because they aren't interested in doing that.
Yeah, so I think in some ways, right, some people are still optimistic that that tradition will continue, right? But many of us are certainly maybe less, less optimistic in the sense that the children who are born in this country or who grew up in this country don't speak the language anymore, right? And so if they can't speak the language, they can't perform those those rituals. The rituals involve sort of more complicated, more sophisticated language, vocabulary, right? And so if they can't speak the language, they can't perform the ceremonies anymore. And so that's why many people are saying maybe that tradition's gonna, die out. And nowadays, I think younger people were also, if they either don't practice, the traditions anymore, or they go to, they either go to church, or they don't. Or they just don't do anything, right? And so there's a whole lot of people who don't practice the traditional religion because they don't know how to do the other rituals and ceremonies. But at the same time, right, they also don't want to go to church. And so they basically are just like floating out there, right? And they don't do anything. And so, yeah, there's a whole lot of sort of people in that, group, particularly people who are now in their 20s and 30s.
Because they got Americanized.
Yeah, they got Americanized. And, yeah. But in my parents' generations, they would either do, church, right? They would either go to church or they would continue to practice the traditional religion. But then again, the people who are born in this country and in their 20s and 30s now, they don't want to go to church. They say that, they don't want to commit going to church every Sunday, and so they don't want to do that too. But at the same time, they also don't know how to, do a lot of the traditional rituals, and so they just ended up not doing anything.
There is a theory that for immigrants, the first generation, so those who might the second generation tend to resist the culture, but then the third generation would actually appreciate to kind of like seek their roots. So maybe the future could be bright.
Yeah, maybe the future could be right. Maybe there's that sense of hope and optimism too. And I mean, the people who are optimistic, they are saying that we see that trend too, right? Which is that they say, look, I mean, when they were going through, elementary and high school, they don't want to speak the language, right? They don't want to learn Hmong, they don't want to speak Hmong, but when they got to the university, for some reason, they go back and they try to reclaim their history, they reconnect with their roots, and they will go and they will take the Hmong language class. And so at the university, right? And so there's that too. And they, so people who are optimistic, they will point to trends like that where they say, look, it's okay, when they are going through this, middle school and high school, they refuse to speak Hmong. They refuse to learn the traditions. But when at a certain point in their life, right, at a certain stage in their life, they're gonna try to reconnect with the community. They're gonna try to come back to the community. They will learn the culture. They will learn the language. They will take time to learn the rituals and so on. And so we also see some of that taking place here too. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And I think we got some food left, right? So thank you for coming.